Hi, my name is Brian Caffo, and I'm in the Department of Biostatistics at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University, and this is the Coursera Data Science Specialization class on rstudioPresenter. This class is co-taught with my co-instructors, Jeff Leake and Roger Pang. Okay, so what is rstudioPresenter? Let me get a nice highlighter here. So RStudio created this authoring tool so that you can create reproducible presentations within their environment. And basically, if you're familiar with Slidify, then you should have zero effort for picking this up. And if you're not familiar with Slidify, I think this is probably a little bit easier to learn. So just like Slidify, code is authored in a generalized markdown format that allows for R code chunks. And the ultimate output is an HTML5 presentation that you view in a web browser. The file index for the presenter file has a .rpres extension instead of a .rmd, .rmarkdown extension like in Slidify. And then there's a lot of GUI tools, and we'll go through them in the environment that you can use. That actually makes this quite nice. If you like to use GUI tools, and maybe if you like to do a lot of command line stuff, maybe Slidify would be better for you. Okay. So the guide that you probably want to follow is on this link right here. Go to that guide. It's very good. Most of this content is just taken from that link, and I created this presentation in RStudioPresenter so you can get a sense what it looks like. The quick start is just you do File and then New File, then R Presentation. And if you're a keystroke junkie, then that's just Alt F, then P. And then you just start using Slidify knitr style commands for authoring content. They walk you through. They have all these things that'll help walk you through it. So single quotes for inline code, triple quotes for block code, and same options as knitr for code evaluation cache. Okay, so here's my presentation that I was working on for today, and you can see here in the preview pane here's the preview. What I could do is, if I wanted to, I could pop this whole thing out into a where am I at? There we go. Into a bigger screen. If you click on this button over here, more, it'll show that you can view it in the browser. You can save it as a web page. You can publish it to rpubs. This clears the cache from the R code that you ran. And this navigates through, and then if you're at a slide that you want and you click on edit, it brings you to that location in the slide over there. Okay, so let's just show you how to get started. So you would just go to File, New File, R Presentation, and then it creates one. Let's just create one called Test. Okay, there it is. Okay. And so now, if I say this is my test presentation, Brian Caffo, and the date is, I don't know, let's just actually put the R date in there. So we'll just do date like that. Okay. And then when I save it, watch what happens. It compiles it, my test presentation, Brian Caffo puts the date in there. Okay. Then you can see how the authoring looks an awful lot like just ordinary old Markdown or Slidify like we've done before. You can see right here where you have some separated out R code. So it'll look like that, where it reproduces the code and then puts it in there. And of course it takes the same sort of commands as knitr and Slidify. So if I did echo equals false, right, and then save it, it reruns it, and there now it's no longer echoing the command. Okay, and then it shows you how you can add in plots and that sort of thing. So during this presentation, what I'm going to just go through is all the options you can go. These equal signs separate the slides. You actually only need 3 of them, right? So if I do that, it gives me that, but if I take away down to 2, it messes up, right? Okay, so you need 3 of them, and then it gives the correct slide transition. Okay, but then and so it's and then if you want help, by the way, Markdown Quick Reference, you can click on that right there and just see your Markdown Quick Reference right there. Okay. Um, Switch the slide there. Okay. So let's talk about, there we go, how it compiles it. So RStudio basically just runs the code every time you save the document. But if you want, you can hit, there's a little refresh button and it will run it, it'll compile it for sure then. There's the MathJax JavaScript library is loaded by default. So if you use this command right there, $x squared $, that's the LaTeX command for x squared, and that just yields the mathematically typeset x squared. Okay. There's slide navigations in the preview that you could take you to advance the slide. You don't get a lot of the nice HTML5 kind of effects in the preview pane. You have to view it in the browser. But in the notepad icon will take you to that slide in the slide deck. So clicking on more yields options for, again, clearing the knitter cache, viewing in a browser. And if you just type view in a browser, it does not create the file in the directory that you're working in, right? It, for me, and I presume for you, it creates it in sort of the temp directory, for your application files. So in mine, it's app data local temp for me. And then you can just create, you can use that also to create an HTML file. Then there's the refresh button that'll refresh it if you've saved some changes and haven't run it yet. And then the zoom button brings up the new window. Okay, so how do you change things? So one thing, so if you notice, like, let me get rid of that. There you go. You notice, like, it's kind of cool, right? I don't know. Maybe you would just view it as gratuitous, superfluous eye candy, but this cube effect, right? I did this for a purpose, and the reason was to show you how you can just change some of the automatic visuals. So at the beginning, right after each slide, there's like a kind of a YAML-like code. And for example, you can just put transition equals rotate, and that that sets the transition to this cube-like rotate. If you do, for example, transition linear, right, which is I think the default, then it'll switch to this sort of linear transition. See, like, that's the linear transition. And then there's the cube transition. The linear transition, and notice I did this right after that slide so that it occurs just for that slide, and then it'll go back to the default if I leave this option out. Whatever you put after the first slide is what it views as the default. And there's a bunch of transition options, and this link right here. This link right here in the presentation file will show you how to do it, or give you a bunch. Actually, I think I like the default probably best. I like just right to left, or left to right. RStudioPresent has a nice built-in hierarchical organization tool. So there's several types, like section, subsection, that sort of thing. So right after a slide, if you do the kind of YAML type code that says type equals type name, I'm sorry, it's getting truncated a little bit here. But if you do type equals type name, then it will create it'll create the slide style for that level of organization. So this style right here, this light blue background with the white heading letters, that's the section. So anyway, this is of type section, and then this link right here, which is getting chopped off. But if you go, obviously if you go to the GitHub, you'll have the right link. And I'm pretty confident that everyone in this class can Google search this. Any rate, it'll give you the collection of sections. So you can have a nice hierarchical organization like LaTeX or some of the or just like ordinary HTML, and it has a different nice kind of formatting for each level of organization. So just by comparison, here's the subsection organization. I didn't put any text, but you get the point. The background is white, that the heading letters are black. Okay, you can do 2 columns, right? So 2 columns is really easy. So basically you just have the slides specified in the ordinary way, but you put a bunch of content, and then on a line by itself, and I could only get it to work when I had a blank line before and after, you put 3 asterisks, and then it'll dump it into 2 columns. And then in the RStudio site, you can change the percent space of each column. If you want like one column to take 70% and the other to take 30%, you can actually change that. You can do that in Slidify too. All the stuff you can do in Slidify. Then after the asterisk, you do whatever for column 2, and it'll put it all in 2 columns. All this, pretty much everything you can do in both. Well, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Oh, see, this got truncated too. So the font family, I didn't have a ton of success just playing around with fonts, and I'll tell you why in a second. So anyway, right after the slide, if you do this kind of YAML-like code, font family equals font name, then that will change the font. This is exactly the same way you would specify in an HTML document the font family. So you can just go to any, like here at W3 Schools, they have a bunch of web-safe fonts, and you can put any of those in. So it's the same way you'd specify a CSS font family. And if you want to import a font, you can do font import URL to import fonts. And so this actual slide right here, you can tell the font, it doesn't look that different. Oh, I hit that link. You can tell it doesn't look that different than this font, but it's different. Is it different? Boy, it doesn't look very different to me. At any rate, I think it is a little different. To me, a lot of the sans serif fonts all look the same. They all look like Helvetica to me. Anyway, use font import to import fonts. And so here's some important caveats. I kind of learned this while I was playing around with the fonts. So the fonts must be present in the system that you're presenting on, or it'll just go back to a fallback. It will go to a fallback font. And again, I'm sorry, I'm truncating the slide there a little bit. If you import a font, then you have to be connected to the internet. So if you were doing an offline presentation, don't do import the font. So here's the font that I imported for this slide. It's called Risque. So anyway, it's called Risque. It doesn't seem that risque. Okay. So what's nice about RStudio Presenter is that it looks pretty nice by default, and it takes almost no time to learn. Probably if you're in this class and you've tried Slidify, you've seen that Slidify takes a little bit of time to learn. RStudio Present takes, if you're familiar with RStudio, takes basically no time to learn. The startup cost is effectively 0. But if you really want to change things, so Slidify, kind of immediately you're closer to being able to tinker with everything. Not perfectly so, but you're closer. If you really want to tinker with everything in either Slidify or in RStudio Present, you really need to know some HTML and some CSS and probably some JavaScript if you really want it to get great. But definitely at least some HTML and CSS if you just want to do the changing the style. If you have in your directory with your presentation file, if you have a CSS file with the same name, it'll just automatically load it up. Or you can just use CSS in the kind of YAML right after the slide definition. You can use css::file.css and it'll import your style sheet. So you can, and if you want, you can create a class and name it class name to get kind of slide specific style control from your CSS. Or if you want even more further control and you don't even want it to be slide specific, if you want it to be specific subset of a slide specific, then you can have that class just be applied within a span. Um, and then, so that's how you could change it permanently, so that when RStudio Presenter compiles it, it compiles it in the style that you want. You know, but there's the other option, is that the end product is an HTML file and a style sheet and maybe some JavaScript, and you can just edit that as you want. But let me just say, this should be a last resort. The whole point of doing these kind of reproducible presentations is that they're reproducible, and that if you change something in the R code, you get the presentation back. So you lose a lot if you edit the raw HTML. At that point, why bother having done Slidify or RStudio Presenter at all? But let's say you have some really final product and you want to get it just right, and you don't want to bother with the intricacies of RStudio Presenter or Slidify or whatever, then sure, you can edit the HTML for that. But if it's like a presentation that you have to give frequently and update with new numbers every now and then you're making a lot of extra work for yourself by editing the HTML file. You're better off just figuring out how to get the CSS file right, the style right, and that way every time you compile it, it'll get it the way you want it to. Okay. And then here's the big question, right, which is Slidify versus RStudio Presenter. And I was a little surprised when I first saw RStudio Presenter, because it has a lot of overlap with Slidify, and so my first question was, why do these two things exist? Why not just either one group or the other just adopt the other one? So here's my impression. So Slidify, to me, gives you a lot more kind of more flexible control from the R Markdown file. So you have a ton kind of more just options as you play around with the R Markdown file, or in RStudio Presenter is what is called the R Pres file. And it's really undergoing constant rapid development. Ramnath is a madman, and he is constantly developing it. It has a large user base, which means like there's lots of questions answered on Stack Exchange, and Ramnath seems to jump on Stack Exchange almost immediately. And he put in lots of styles and options by default. So you have all the different HTML5 slide decks are basically included, and you can do them all fairly easily. It has a much steeper learning curve to go from 0 to functional in Slidify, a much steeper learning curve. And I would describe it as more kind of command line oriented. RStudio Presenter is much more integrated within RStudio, and it's probably preferable to work with the RStudio GUI. So the RStudio Presenter is embedded in RStudio, which is a good and a bad thing. If you're more of a command line person, you probably maybe want the kind of way in which Slidify is implemented a little bit more. Though I'm confident there's probably a way you can do most of the RStudio things from the command line as well. But I think of it as more GUI oriented. RStudio Presenter is ridiculously easy to get started. I basically knew nothing and created this presentation and lecture in one day. And one thing that struck me about RStudio Presenter relative to Slidify was how easy it was to learn. Now, to be fair, I knew Slidify first, and so I had a lot of knowledge to build on, but just my impression of the software is that it is extremely easy to use. And part of the reason it's easy to use is it has a much smaller set of kind of canonical styles and options, right? So it's this kind of paradox of choice type thing, where we actually are a little bit happier if we have less choice. It's how the Apple Store works, right? They give you relatively few choices, and it turns out people are happier if they have fewer choices, or so that's the lore. I don't know if that's true at all. But at any rate, this makes me happy that there's fewer choices, because I'm the kind of person that if there's lots of choices, I tinker around with them, and then I look, and then it's like an hour later and I've done nothing. Okay, so this smaller set of styles actually helps people like me that are over tinkerers. As far as I'm concerned, the default style looks really nice, and so I wouldn't, it seems fine. So that's actually a nice component of RStudio Presenter. And either with RStudio Presenter or Slidify, remember, ultimately, all this is using R as a front end to create an HTML5 slide deck. So if you have a little CSS or HTML knowledge, you can make either RStudio Presenter or Slideify as elaborate as you'd like. And the big step is deciding that you want a reproducible presentation with R embedded in your presentation building software, and then I think either of these solutions will work quite well.